At the moment I was dying, I screamed the name of someone I had spent 30 years insisting didn't exist. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not a religious conversion, not a deathbed ritual, not a man who secretly always believed and finally gave himself permission to admit it. I mean a philosophy professor. 2 published books arguing against the existence of God. 26 years of lectures dedicated to dismantling faith as an intellectual failure. Lying on an operating table with his chest open, bleeding out, and screaming that name with everything he had left. And something answered. What happened next is why I'm here. And I need to tell you all of it, because what I was shown in the 4 minutes and 37 seconds that my heart was not beating is the thing I would trade every book, every lecture, every professional achievement of my life to have understood 50 years earlier. But first, let me tell you who I was, because it matters. I didn't just lack belief in God. I considered it an intellectual duty to make that clear in lecture halls, at dinner parties, in the pages of those 2 published books. I was the man who called faith the most expensive comfort blanket in human history. I said it with a smile. I got laughs. I was proud of that line. And I was the kind of man who, when a student told me her mother had a near-death experience and saw something extraordinary, looked at her with measured patience and explained, gently, condescendingly, that what she described was textbook hypoxic hallucination. A brain starved of oxygen producing its last desperate theater before the curtain came down. I handed her a reading list. I moved on. That was the man who walked into a restaurant one October evening, ordered dinner, and before the food arrived, felt the world break in half. The pain was unlike anything in my medical vocabulary. A tearing sensation beneath the sternum, something structural, something that was not supposed to move, moving. I doubled forward. I couldn't make a sound. By the time the ambulance arrived, I had lost enough blood that the surgical team later described my condition in their notes with a phrase I will never forget: incompatible with sustained life. I went into cardiac arrest on the table before they could begin the surgery. My heart stopped for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I remember that number precisely because I am a man who has always believed precision is what separates knowledge from faith. Now, I told you I screamed a name I didn't believe in. What I haven't told you yet is what happened the moment I did. Stay with me. In my professional life, I taught that the mind constructs reality, that consciousness is a product of neural architecture, that when the architecture stops, the construction stops, and what remains is simply nothing. I thought I knew what nothing was. I had no idea. What I entered in the instant my heart stopped was not an absence of experience. It was the most concentrated presence I have ever encountered. A stillness so structural, so real, that it made everything I had previously called real feel like a sketch of itself. No pain, not pain that subsided. The entire substrate that makes pain possible, gone. No body, no location, no time. I can give you 4 minutes and 37 seconds because that's what the clock in the operating room recorded. I cannot give you what passed on my side because passing requires a before and an after, and those categories had ceased to apply. It was as if I had been folded into the space between 2 moments. And the space between 2 moments has no duration. It simply is. And then, in what felt like the same instant, something opened. Not a tunnel, not a light above me. Something that moved through me, like a signal reaching a receiver that had been built for exactly this frequency, but had never been switched on. And I understood, with a clarity that bypassed thought entirely, that I was not dreaming, I was not hallucinating. The epistemological markers were all wrong for that. The resolution too high, the internal logic too rigorous, the information density beyond anything my mind at its peak could have generated on its own. I was receiving something. A transmission, prophetic, compressed, and absolutely precise. A window into a future event, something that has not yet occurred, but will. Something that will change everything. And the first thing I saw, the very first image that came through that transmission, stopped me completely. Because it wasn't light. It wasn't peace. It was shadows, my own. I need to describe what I mean by that carefully because I don't want to mislead you about what this was. The shadows weren't punishment. They weren't hell in any theological sense I had ever cataloged. They were something more precise than that, and in some ways more devastating. They were a mirror. Every instance of contempt I had expressed as academic rigor. Every time I had used intelligence as a weapon against someone's need to believe in something. The student with the reading list. The colleagues I had edged out of conversations with a well-placed citation. The relationships I had kept at arm's length because intimacy was epistemologically inconvenient. All of it reflected back with absolute fidelity. Not judged, shown. And I tried. And this is the part that shattered me. I tried to think my way out of it. My first instinct, facing the shadow version of my own life, was to construct a counter-argument, to find the logical flaw in the premise, to reach for the tool that had served me for 30 years. The tool didn't work. For the first time in my adult life, my mind went completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of a man who has found his answer, the terrifying silence of a man who has run out of road. And in that silence, from somewhere that was not thought, not belief, not anything I had a category for, something came out of me, raw, pre-verbal. The kind of sound a person makes when every sophisticated layer has been stripped away, and what's left is the bare thing underneath. I called a name, his name, and the shadows dissolved. What replaced them was unlike anything language was designed to carry. The earth. But not the earth I knew. The same ground, the same geography, but restored to something so fundamentally original that seeing it made the version I had lived on feel like a faded copy of a copy. The sky was a depth of blue that pulsed gently, as if the atmosphere itself were breathing. The air didn't fill your lungs, it washed through you. Every breath felt like the first drink of cold water after a crossing you'd almost not survived. And the peace. I need to find words for this because it is the thing that changed me more than anything else in the vision. It was not passive, not the peace of a quiet room or an empty afternoon. It was an active force, a living presence that moved through layers of damage I hadn't recognized as damage. The years of contempt, the years of keeping the universe at arm's length so it couldn't ask anything of me. The loneliness I had dressed up as intellectual independence. On contact with that peace, all of it simply released. The way a fist finally opens after holding something too tightly for too long. And then I saw the people. I want to describe this differently than you may have heard it described before, because what struck me first was not the emotion, it was the logic. As a man who had spent his life chasing rigorous internal consistency, what I saw made a kind of sense that nothing in my academic career had ever achieved. People whose bodies had been spent by time and illness were opening their eyes. And the eyes that opened were not the clouded, effortful eyes of the aged. They were radiant, vital, operating at what I can only describe as factory specification, the body doing exactly what it was designed to do, uncorrupted by everything that had been done to it. Around 30 years of age, each of them, running toward each other with the certainty of people for whom no time has passed. Because for them, and this is the part that arrested me completely, no time had. They had closed their eyes, and the very next thing was this. What had felt to those left behind like years, like a wound that never closed, was, from the other side, less than a breath. The logic of it was staggering, clean, irreducible. And then the children. Here, I need to ask you to stay with me, because what I'm about to describe is the thing that, when I tell it, consistently breaks people open. And I want to be precise about what I saw. There were mothers there whose arms had been empty in ways that mark a person permanently. Women who had said goodbye to children they never got to introduce to the world, or who had held small hands and watched a life leave that had barely begun. And in this moment of restoration, I watched those mothers cross the luminous ground not at a walk, not at the measured pace of someone preparing themselves, but at a run. The run of someone who has been waiting so long that the waiting itself has become a kind of weight they've been carrying everywhere. And now it has lifted, and the only thing left is to get there. And they got there. And I understood, not with my mind, but with something the mind is only a shadow of, that those children would be raised. That every year stolen, every empty room, every unanswered prayer would be answered in that single moment and in all the moments that follow. IT. The reunion wasn't a farewell dressed up as a hello. It was the beginning of something. Now, the animals. I was a man who had spent his career analyzing symbolic language, and my first instinct was to file what I was seeing under symbol. I dismissed that instinct almost immediately, because what I was observing had none of the impressionistic quality of symbolic content. It was specific, physical, and frankly, disorienting in its precision. Across those restored fields, animals moved with a quality of freedom I have no referent for in the living world. Horses covering ground in wide arcs, not the controlled, managed movement of a trained animal, but something that looked like what horses were doing before anyone decided they needed to be useful. Dogs moving through the crowds of gathered people with their entire bodies expressing a state I can only call elemental joy. Not the performed happiness of domestication, but something that came from a deeper source. Birds landing on outstretched arms as naturally as breathing. A stillness between species that would, in the world I knew, have triggered every survival instinct those creatures possessed. And here is what stopped me. The detail that a philosopher notices when he should probably just feel it. None of these animals were looking for anyone in particular. They were present, fully, purely present, moving among the people, alongside the people, as if the restoration of the earth included the restoration of something that had been broken between humans and the rest of creation since. Very near the beginning, as if the long, violent distance between wild and tame had simply been dissolved, and what was left was a harmony that didn't require management. It was just the natural state of things, finally allowed to be natural. I had no category for it. I still don't. What I know is that it was real, it was beautiful, and it added something to the vision that I cannot explain in terms of wish fulfillment or projection, because it was not something I would have thought to wish for. And then the vision turned its attention toward me. Not the scene, not the landscape. Something in the vision, a presence I had been aware of at the edges, moved to the center. And what arrived was not warmth, not judgment, something older than either. And it said one sentence that dismantled everything I had built in 30 years more thoroughly than the shadows had. I'm going to tell you what that sentence was. But first, I need to give you the context, because without the context, it's just words. And these were not just words. In the operating room, in the seconds before my heart stopped, I had done something I had never done in my adult life. Something that violated every principle I had published, every position I had defended. In the moment when my intellect had nothing left to offer me, when my frameworks had burned through and left nothing underneath, I had opened my mouth and said a name. Not a prayer, not a theological statement. Something rawer than that. The cry of something underneath the professor, underneath the author, underneath the man who had spent 3 decades being the smartest person in the room. I cried out to someone I had spent my career insisting was not there. And now, inside the vision, the someone who had been not there was present. And the sentence, delivered not as accusation, not as divine recrimination, but with the quiet, complete, almost clinical precision of an observation that requires no editorial comment, was this. You called my name, but you never once sought to know me. That's it. No thunder, no list of offenses, no verdict. Just that. And I understood, with the same part of me that had dissolved in silence when the shadows showed me myself, that this was not a criticism. It was a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was accurate. I had called the name in desperation, in the terminal extremity of a man who has run out of all other options. And the name had worked. The shadows had dissolved. The vision had opened. The transmission had come through. But what the sentence clarified was the distinction between a cry of need and a life of seeking, between using a name as an emergency exit and genuinely wanting to know the one it belongs to. I had done the first. I had never done the second. And the thing that broke open in me, not with pain, but with a quality of grief that was also, strangely, a quality of relief, was the understanding of what I had missed. Not heaven, not a prize for correct behavior, but knowing. The actual experience of knowing the one who had designed all of this, designed me, had been, apparently, knowable this entire time, available to any honest search, waiting at the end of any genuinely humble question. And I had spent 58 years building elaborate intellectual architecture specifically to avoid going anywhere near that search. I had been afraid. That's the truth I couldn't say in any lecture hall. That underneath the rigor and the skepticism and the comfortable superiority of a man who has read more than you, there was fear. The fear of what it might cost to find something real. The fear of having to revise the model. The fear of being wrong about the thing I had staked my entire identity on being right about. And what the vision showed me, with the same unbearable clarity with which it had shown me my own shadows, was that the search I had refused to make is the only one that leads anywhere permanent. That everything else I had accumulated, the credentials, the positions, the well-crafted arguments, was impressive furniture in a room with no foundation. The only preparation that matters for what is coming is the sincere search for the one who prepared it, not a religion. I want to be exact about this because the man I was would have immediately converted that statement into a debate about which tradition had the superior epistemological claim. And that is precisely the move that keeps you from what you're actually being asked to do. I'm not talking about tradition. I'm talking about the terrifying, costly, daily practice of genuinely wanting to know, of asking real questions and waiting for real answers, of being willing to be changed by what you find. That is what I had never done. That is what I came back to do. The vision ended the way it had begun, without transition. One moment, the luminous ground, the living sky, the presence at the center of everything. The next, cold, the smell of antiseptic, the mechanical rhythm of equipment doing the work my body had stopped doing on its own. And pain, not the tearing physical pain of the perforation, but the heavy structural pain of a body that has been opened and repaired and is now being asked to function again. I am told I returned with no warning, that the team had not yet made the decision they were about to make, that what happened from a clinical standpoint had no clear cause. I know the cause. I was not finished. The transmission wasn't meant to end with me. It was meant to be carried back to anyone who is carrying a name tonight, a face. Someone who closed their eyes and left a shape in your life that nothing has been able to fill. I opened my eyes. The room was quiet, in a way that the nurse beside me, 19 years in resuscitations, later told me she had never experienced. Not the quiet of a room where something bad was narrowly avoided. Something else, a quality she said she didn't have words for. I understood it. I had just come from the source of it. The next morning, the first thing I asked the nurse to help me do was write a note. Not to my publisher, not to the university, to a student, the one who had told me about her mother's near-death experience years before, the one I had handed a reading list. I wrote, "You were right, I'm sorry. She was right too." It was the most honest thing I had written in 30 years. I want to speak to you directly now, past whatever brought you here. If you are carrying someone, if there is a person who left a hole in your life that nothing has managed to fill, I want you to hear this from someone who spent his entire career on the other side of this conversation. For them, there was no suffering in the leaving. In the moment those eyes closed, everything that was happening to the body simply stopped mattering. There was no dark, no cold, no awareness of time passing. Only the deepest rest imaginable. And then, from their side, the very next thing is the world I was shown. The restoration, the reunion, the opening of eyes in a place where wholeness is the default, not the miracle. They are not suffering, they are not conscious of distance. They are not waiting in some vague intermediate state, wondering if they've been forgotten. They are in a sleep without dreams, without duration. And the next thing they will know is that morning. And that morning is coming. If you lost a child, if you have lived with that particular wound, I saw the reunion. I saw it with the same precision I brought to everything I ever studied. And I am telling you, with everything I have left, it is real, it is coming, and it will be exactly what you most need it to be, and more. The distance between you and the people you love is not measured in years. It is measured in a single breath. Now, here is what I came back to say, and I want to say it without the armor I used to wear. There is a creator, and that creator is knowable. Not through performance, not through the right label, not through inheriting the correct tradition and executing its rituals correctly, but through a search that costs something. Through the honest, sustained, imperfect, daily practice of genuinely wanting to know what is actually being asked of you, of living in a way that aligns with what you find. I spent 58 years being educated. I spent almost none of that time in search of the one who educated me, who designed the architecture I spent my life studying and never once asked who the architect was. If you are reading this and you are where I was, if the intellectual armor fits too comfortably, if the skepticism has become load-bearing, I am not asking you to abandon your mind. I am asking you to point it at the thing it was most afraid to look at. The search is real. The answer is available. And what is waiting at the end of it is what I saw. The full, luminous, impossibly beautiful scope of what has been prepared for those who genuinely sought the one who prepared it. Start there and tell me in the comments, who is the person whose face you are holding on to? The one you are living this life for? The one you cannot wait to find on the other side of that morning? I'll be reading every word.